Our topic today is the cattle industry in Colorado. I'd like to give you a short history and some information to help you move forward. To our best knowledge, the cattle industry began in Colorado about 1540. We believe that Coronado, one of the Spanish conquistadors, was one of the first people who brought cattle to Colorado, and that was to the southeast corner of the state. The next notable date we should kind of put these events in perspective with is 1776, when the United States established independence from Great Britain. Things continued in this fashion, with cattle being semi-wild and roaming the plains, if you will, until 1821. At that point, Mexico established independence from Great Britain. One of Colorado's oldest towns, which is called San Luis, was developed by Mexican citizens who were awarded a land grant. And the way a land grant works is that land is free to them for development of a certain thing. And in this situation, it was a town. San Luis became one of the biggest trading posts of the area, but it's important to know that it was originally settled by Mexican people. In 1851, when the town was kind of considered developed, more and more settlers came and brought cattle and sheep with them. There was a lot of trading that went on in San Luis because people could come from the territories north and up from Mexico and kind of met in the middle. In addition, people traded a lot with the native people, the Native Americans that lived there. There was a couple trails that went through there, namely the Santa Fe Trail and the Cherokee Trail. There were fur traders who brought their furs in to sell them, and it really was a very productive and diverse place. Bent's Fort was one of the places they traded a lot. This was built in 1832 by two brothers named Charles and William Bent. It kind of became the trading center for the Southern Rockies. And so if you can visualize it, or if you've ever had the opportunity to visit there, it's kind of fun to picture traders coming in with cattle and sheep. They would bring tired oxen and purchase new ones. People brought in homemade blankets and goods and traded furs and anything you can really imagine. Bent's Fort had a very unique design. It was built in a square with the trading plaza in the middle, and all of the entries on the outside could be boarded up rather quickly because, believe it or not, there were different subgroups of people that would occasionally attack Bent's Fort, so it needed protection from the outside elements or attacks. And so it was kind of funny because there was 2 layers of building, and they were all made into hotel-like rooms and shops. I heard that the shops were on the ground floor and the hotel rooms on the second floor. And then if there was an attack forged, they could simply board it up, bring all the people inside, and keep them safe. This is a picture of some cattle coming up from Mexico years and years ago. I put it in here to help you remember that the types and breeds of cattle were very different looking coming from different places in the United States. In this unit, as you begin to look up some of the breeds of cattle that we have, you'll notice that their geographic origin plays a big part. Now, you heard me say that the Mexican people originally established San Luis, and that is why we have so many ranching traditions that are really based off Spanish-American tradition. The Spanish culture was alive and well long before the colonial Americans came from the East. We still to this day use many aspects of the Spanish system of handling cattle. And so we're at about 400 years ago now that Spanish settlers actually had those original cattle there. Now, in early times, cattle were just set free to graze and reproduce. There were no fences, and we'll talk about how that kind of came in with history. The term for a Spanish cowboy is a vaquero, and they would stay horseback and care for the vaca, or cattle, as a career. There's a lot of the tools and clothing and customs that American cowboys picked up from vaqueros. One is this idea of a wide-brimmed hat that protects you from the sun and the weather. Things like leather pants or chaps to cover your pants so that your legs are protected from shrubs and thorns as you ride through, and then saddles, and the style of saddle, including the horn to tie a rope to. Here's a few other Spanish words that we have adopted into our language. I think you guys are really familiar with all of them. A bronco being a wild horse, la bandana. I won't go through the whole list, but I'm sure you've heard many of them in your everyday discussions. This slide says to, on your worksheet, match the words with their Spanish description. I forgot to take that phrase out of there, but I would like you to maybe pick 3 of these words you're not familiar with and put them in your notes with their meanings so that you can broaden your language horizons. In about 1858, something strange happened, and it began to form the cattle industry of Colorado. There was a guy named Jack Henderson who came into the east side of Denver along the Platte River, and they had had a really long, hard trip from the east. They were headed west for a variety of reasons. I don't know Henderson's reason, but people came west to discover gold. People came west to homestead. There were many, many reasons. So he showed up in Denver late in the fall, early winter. His oxen were nearly dead. They were so spent. And so as means of just letting nature take its toll, he took them away from where they made camp and turned them loose. And he fully expected the next spring when he went back to look for them to find a pile of bones, to have them dead. And instead he was shocked at what he found. They were thriving. They were fat and sassy and healthy and in far better condition than he left them. And what he realized was that when he turned them loose in an area that had a lot of pasture, that had a good water source, and that had a relatively mild winter. So the cattle were able to kind of recuperate from the long journey. He caught them again. He took them to Denver, sold them, received a good price, and that helped his family survive. Others also did this. This kind of became a trend, and there were many pioneers who were able to make a little bit of money that way. His last name, Henderson, is now a town that exists outside Denver. What had happened in the meantime is by 1859, a lot of gold miners were coming into the state, and the demand for beef really increased. They were coming across the plains, but gold miners traveled with very little, and so they would get here to Colorado and they wouldn't have a food source. A lot of these pioneers could either let their cattle breed and sell the calves, or just fatten those oxen up and butcher them to help feed the gold miners and make some money. They estimate that in that time period of 1859 to 1860, gold fever caused almost an extra 100,000 people to head to Colorado. Most of them never found gold. Many of them did stay in Colorado. This is a picture of one of the early packing plants where they butchered beef and prepared those cuts for people. Now, I told you that others did this. This trend caught on. Samuel Hartzell did the same thing, actually kind of separately in a different area of Colorado, but he also ended up looking for gold here. He came, found the same thing that Henderson did with his oxen, and ended up making a business out of it. He would buy footsore and sore-necked oxen from people who were hauling freight, and he bought them really cheap, like 10 or 20 bucks a head. He'd put the cattle out to eat grass and take care of them, and he sold them as fat cattle for $90 to $100 a head. Demand for beef was huge, and so by 1861, he actually bought 22 shorthorns and started his own cattle herd. This is an incorrect date. By 1864, He had 164 cows and a bull that he had purchased from Missouri, and Hartzell became one of the first cattlemen in Colorado. On We don't have a worksheet that goes through this, but let's calculate how much profit did he make off each animal. Let's say he bought it on the expensive side at $20. He sold it for $100. Keep in mind, both of those amounts were rather large amounts back in that day and age. He made almost $80 per head. That definitely was a better living than most of the gold miners were making. Next, I want to talk about the Goodnight Loving Trail. If you take a look at that map, the Goodnight Loving Trail was actually just a cattle trail. It went all the way from Fort Belknap, which is near Abilene in Texas, clear up to Cheyenne, Wyoming. It's named after two gentlemen, Charles Goodnight, and I believe it's Henry Loving. And so they got their start in part from Wesley Iliff. Wesley Iliff would also buy footsore cattle and oxen from immigrants, but he would also buy Texas Longhorns from Texas. And so that gave Charles Goodnight and Henry Loving an idea, and they went all the way down to Texas and bought as many Longhorns as they could, made a huge herd, and drove it all the way up to Cheyenne. There was a couple thousand head of cattle in that group. They would move rather slowly. It took a lot of cowboys on the trail, and they moved the entire herd up the Goodnight Loving Trail, and then they would sell them either along the way or to Cheyenne. Now, the other thing that had happened by this point is that the railways were coming through, and so that became a really important thing to happen, is that people would drive cattle live to the rail station, and they would put them on a train car, and take them back east towards Chicago as a food source. Both Goodnight and Loving and Wesley Iliff all became very successful businessmen, and Iliff was actually termed for a long time the cattle king of Colorado. Now, in 1861 and clear through 1865, we saw a lot of effects on the cattle industry from the Civil War. Many people went to fight in the war, and it had some pretty big effects on society. So it slowed things down, but people were still doing it to some extent. Joseph McCoy was one of the earliest people who decided to drive cattle from Abilene up to where they could be shipped to Chicago. And so they tried this in a variety of places. Finally, by 1869, there was a trainload stop in Kit Carson, Colorado, and they brought the first trainload of cattle up there and sold them. Now, in Chicago, you could get more per head for your cattle. So if you sold those same cows in Abilene for 15 or 18 bucks a head, in Chicago, they could bring 24 or 28 bucks a head. So it became a benefit to their businesses if they would get the cattle to the places where there were more population. That's a picture of some real early train cars. They were not near as safe or strong as what we have now, but they definitely would get the cattle there. And then the upper picture is a picture of a very early feedlot. Now, one of the things we haven't talked about is when they were on those long trails, people had to eat while they moved the cows, and that's where we come across the advent of the chuck wagon. And so always when they'd take a herd of cattle, there would be usually a cowboy or a cook that they hired, and they would pack the chuck wagon and pull it behind horses or mules. It was like a mobile kitchen. So it usually had this really cool cupboard on the back of the trailer. They literally didn't have to set up anything. They would stop and unhook the mules and let them eat, and then they would get to cooking. They still had to build a fire. They cooked most everything on the fire, and provisions were very simple because there was no refrigeration. They would pack beans. They would make biscuits. Everything was definitely made from scratch, and they ate rather simple. This is a picture of a chuck wagon out of in a museum, but it's really pretty close and closely accurate. The only thing missing is the fabric that would go over the covered wagon. Now, that's the early beginnings, but the value of cattle to the Colorado economy has always been something rather remarkable. And so, if you look at this graph across the bottom, it shows you that goes all the way from 1860 to 1980. And we see the number of cattle in Colorado steadily climb. There are some dips in the numbers, but it keeps steadily climbing up. Cattle have always been an important industry to our state. Cattle prices have also changed. If you'll take a look, things stayed fairly level until about 1920. Then we saw a decent rise. We saw another big rise in 1950, and then more and more frequently we see those prices go up. Oftentimes we're asked what events cause these major changes in prices. In modern time, those prices are typically driven by supply and demand and also the value of inputs. So if I'm feeding my cattle hay all winter and the price of hay goes up, I have to charge more for my cattle. Okay, this concludes our discussion today. You should have taken about half a page of notes so that you can remember the key points. And if you didn't, please feel free to work backwards and get the main points so that you're prepared for our next step of the discussion. Have a good day.